All right, shall we start? I'll introduce OSL. Just going to do a quick introduction, and then Claudia, it's all about you. So I wanted to introduce OSL's first live stream of Creatively Disabled. And OSL Open Style Labs is a lab based inside Parsons School of Design in New York. We focus on creating accessible style for people with disabilities. And we do this in different ways through education. We run a summer program each year where we get a group of students from the fashion school, occupational therapists, engineers together and collaborate with a person with a disability to create clothing specifically for their needs. We also do a lot of work with research and trying to make changes within the fashion industry to make real change of making clothes more accessible. We started Creatively Disabled because we wanted there to be a space and a discussion about where creativity and disability kind of intersect. We believe that people with disabilities live in a life with loads of kind of problem solving every day and restraints, and creativity is all about those things. So we wanted a positive space in order to have that discussion. Your host today, I'm Yasmin Keats. I myself was born with nerve damage to my right leg and lower back. I'm a researcher at OSL. We have Poppy and Snow. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit. And we have the wonderful Claudia Walder, who is a founder and editor-in-chief of Abel Zine. Abel Zine, a platform and a publication dedicated to empowering disabled and chronically ill creatives and communities. Claudia is also a journalist, creative, art director, model, and former fashion stylist. She lives with ME and chronic fatigue syndrome. I'll let her explain a little bit more about that. And we're so excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much. And Poppy, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Love that.
And
hi, I'm Poppy. I am disabled. I'm chronically ill. I have ME, just like Claudia does. I have fibromyalgia, a bunch of cognitive disabilities, and if you can think it, I probably have it. But yes, I'm really excited to discuss creativity and how that really intersects with disability and chronic illness as a whole. Because I think you can't have one without the other in my life. It really impacts, my chronic illness really impacts my creative flow and processes. So really excited to start this discussion. And yeah, Snow, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. This is Snow here. I'm an artist, designer, and currently the program coordinator for Open Style Lab. So yeah, I've been with OSL for like about 1.5 years now, working on different kinds of fashion educational programs that related to designing fashion-assisted products with the disability communities. Today, I will be running in the back end, so you won't see my face, but I'm here to support.
I will mention, sorry, I'm the community manager at Open Style Lab. I was on the fellowship in 2020 as the first communications fellow, and that was amazing. And I went on to now sort of conduct the social strategy and community management of Open Style Lab. So yeah, that's how we're here today. And shall I start with the first question and get the discussion going? Because I'm really excited, I just want to start. So hi, Claudia. Would you mind telling us about yourself and what disabilities do you identify with, and what's your current occupational status in life?
I just want to check first if you want me to do an image description of myself. I'm not sure if you'll be saving this or yeah. Okay. Well, I'm Claudia. I'm based in London. I'm currently in my living room, which has white blinds behind me and pale cream walls and a painting of a flower in the background. I'm an olive-skinned woman with short, dark brown hair. I'm wearing a dark green polo neck with some necklaces and a little bit of makeup on my face.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. I really feel like I should have done my own. I am Poppy. I have long blonde hair. I'm white and I'm wearing a sort of green cardigan, and I'm just sitting in bed because chronically ill life. And just a short rundown. But yeah, thank you for telling us about like what you're currently doing and where you currently are. Do you want to tell us about yourself and your disabilities and what you identify with?
Yeah, so my first official diagnosis was ME, also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis, or more commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome. I was subsequently diagnosed with fibromyalgia because chronic pain was increasingly a dominant kind of effect of the ME. But really, I think it's all joint to hypermobility, which is something that I've had since I was born. Really, from puberty onwards, I was having a lot of musculoskeletal issues and needing to see physiotherapists and, bed rest from like bending over and pulling something. So yeah, I always felt like I was like an old lady living in a young person's body. That's kind of the phrase I would always use because, I was really athletic and very much able to do the same things as other kids my age. But I always felt like I was having to deal with repercussions of exercise and stretching in a way that other people just didn't seem to feel. So yeah, I was having like sciatica, slip discs, and all these different types of things from quite a young age. And yeah, so hypermobility I was diagnosed with around the same time as fibromyalgia. So it's possible that I have EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but it's very difficult to get a diagnosis for that on the NHS. ME kind of caused a lot of other issues in my body. At the time, I was very kind of light and noise sensitive. I still can be. So environmental sensitivity, sensory sensitivity is something that does impact me. Initially, very early on in my diagnosis, I could barely eat. My metabolism just stopped. It was actually an onset after taking a course of antibiotics because I'd never had any digestive issues in my life prior to that or any food allergies. And all of a sudden it was like just turmoil in my gut, no matter what I ate, no matter what time of day it was, and I lost a lot of weight. So yeah, I would say that I kind of went from able-bodied to disabled in a very quick space of time. It was like a very sharp decline. So I'd previously been working as a fashion stylist. It's quite a physically demanding job. If anybody's done it before, there's a lot of kind of suitcase pulling and like lugging things around town, getting on public transport, which, is funny. The job that I was in, I could kind of assess accessibility of public transport at that time based on whether I had suitcases with me or not, because I would have to pull a lot of them up the stairs, by myself, and was obviously damaging my body in the process probably. So yeah, I was diagnosed with gastroparesis a few years later because of my digestion. And then in the background, I was experiencing endometriosis-like symptoms as well. Now I'm on the pill and they've kind of stopped my period, so I don't bleed anymore and I don't have the same sort of physical pain that I was having at that time. Obviously, endometriosis, for those that don't know, is also a really difficult condition to be diagnosed with because it requires an operation. The NHS are not necessarily willing to do physical operations on people without significant disability, essentially. And so the first port of call is to use birth control. So currently it's being managed. I don't know, whether that means I do have it or I don't, but after I was diagnosed with ME, I don't know, we're getting pretty private here, but I basically would bleed every day of the year. Like it was non-stop bleeding. So at that point, I just didn't know what was wrong with me, but it was quite horrible, an experience to have. So I'm very grateful that I don't have periods any longer. It's allowed me to have a little bit more of my life back, which has been really nice because my menstrual cycle and my digestion were very, very linked, and having poor digestion with gastroparesis, which is slow gastric emptying. It basically means that the food stays in your stomach a lot longer than it should do, which means you're more likely to be nauseous, more likely to throw up and things like that. So yeah, it was a really difficult time. I was having like paralysis down one of my sides and all these kind of undiagnosed neurological issues. So just lots of tests, lots of different kind of departments that I was being put through, lots of different kind of professional opinions and tests being ran on me. But a lot of the time, like, things came up blank or normal. So yeah, eventually I just kind of stopped seeking like a cure or trying to get better, because it just didn't feel like I was really going to ever receive the support that I actually needed, at least on the NHS. And if I did try and pursue kind of like private treatments, they would often make me worse or sicker than I was before. And so I developed a little bit of distrust with kind of alternative medicine as well. Things have been getting better, but probably around the same time as things were really bad, I would say like depression and anxiety were also things that I was quite heavily affected by, because it's so kind of disillusioning to become chronically ill. It's a very isolating experience, and I think it's only natural to kind of suffer mentally with your mental health when your body is just like a source of chaos for you, and mostly because of how that impacts the world around you, your friends and your family, and not everyone reacts in the way that you would want them to. So yeah, it's a really difficult thing to deal with on your own, but I've gotten here. I'm here today. I'm still alive. I'm doing well, you know, at least as well as I can be. And yeah.
No, I'm glad to hear that, and I relate so heavily with so much of what you said in regards to your period and EDS diagnosis, and it's such a heavy thing to carry and exhausting, and that exhaustion, that external exhaustion, it just takes such a toll mentally on you, and it really just put you almost like into a sort of a hole in your head where you just can't get out of it, and it's really hard to motivate yourself to really want to be a person, but also be creative and do things you enjoy. Because if your body's not working with you, and then your mind begins not to work with you because you're so exhausted from your body, it's just so difficult and really like limiting. And what I find more limiting is the external, the people and the treatment, and people not listening, not being supportive. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know how hard it is to talk about that sort of thing. You dig deep and it's so traumatic to talk about, but I appreciate it, and really leads into what motivates you now to pursue what you're currently doing creatively with your practices. And is that something you always wanted to do, really? And how did you find that motivation to continue to be creative through all of that?
It was a pretty straightforward process for me, apart from the first 6 months after I was diagnosed, because I honestly thought I was dying, and it was really scary. I felt like I was mentally going crazy, because one of the symptoms of ME, sometimes, you know, I think it manifests differently in everybody, and that's kind of why it's difficult to talk about this condition. Also why it's difficult to treat and difficult to diagnose and all these other things. But there's this term of kind of tired and wired. Basically, it's to do with your fight or flight. So in the first 6 months, I was incredibly tired and wired. Like, I would sleep 16 hours a day, and then for the night time when I would be awake, your mind is just going at like 150 miles a minute, and it feels so intense that honestly I was like, I'm going crazy. And it was yeah, very, very scary period of time for me. But then I kind of like had an epiphany at some point, you know, 6 months or so later, where I was really struggling with this idea of like, am I disabled now, essentially. What does it mean to be disabled? Because everything I see about disability is predominantly for like a much older generation. So how do I fit in? Is anyone going to take me seriously? How do I communicate this thing, which is very, very laden with shame? Like it feels like there's so much like disability is shrouded in shame, essentially. That these are like the misconceptions that people have about it, and it was something that I was beginning to think about more and more and more. And essentially, neurological illness kind of runs in my family. My mom has Parkinson's disease, and had been diagnosed for at least about 10 years before I was diagnosed. So although it's a different disability, I've kind of grown up watching my mom come to terms with her disability and also work and have a social life alongside it. And I guess to be diagnosed in a later part in her life, it was early onset, but really it was at the beginning of her 40s. So it's younger than most people that when they get diagnosed with Parkinson's, because that's also kind of misinterpreted as an old people's disease, but it's not. So yeah, I began to kind of reckon with the shame that I was feeling, and I began to think about whether I was ashamed of my mum for being disabled, and it was just like a light went off, and I was like, no, like not at all. So I really need to deal with the internalized ableism that I'm feeling. And I also need to kind of begin to think about why I had all of those feelings to begin with, and what it really meant, and what our society is teaching about disability. And that's why, coming from a fashion background, and specifically in London, which I feel like is a hub of creativity and also one of the fashion capitals of the world. So one thing that I think like New York and London have in common is this kind of, I don't want to say obsession, but we're interested and passionate about diversity as an industry. And I think often it can be tokenized by some people in the industry, whether it's brands, whether it's organizations, and other people take it very, very seriously because it's who they are, and it's who their communities are that they are part of. And so it's very, very important. But I basically was like, wow, all this time I've been creating work around diversity, and I've never once seen a disabled person in fashion, like not just in my like community, but across the spectrum, like fashion magazines around the world, designers, even things like adaptive fashion, even disabled models, like they were not there, and if they were, it was like 1 in a million. You know, that was kind of how rare it was to see somebody with a disability on a magazine cover or inside the magazine. And definitely nobody talked about it. So from a writing perspective as well, I'd studied journalism at university. I just decided to go towards styling because it's more visual, and that was kind of what I was more passionate about at the time. But yeah, I was like, wow, there's just no disability representation. So I felt like I needed to do something about it. And 18 months later, I made these.
Amazing.
So yeah, I'm more than happy to talk about a little kind of.
Yeah, Claudia, could you share us a little bit about Abel Zine and how it came about, and what is the future? How do you see it, and what you created?
Well, yeah, so I basically just decided, it's funny, I never really had a very good opinion of magazines coming from a journalism background. Like, I just saw them as like kind of expenses that one didn't need. They weren't really like essential to me to kind of, even though I was styling all these like fashion editorials and stuff to go inside magazines, I never really bought any myself. You know, it was funny. I guess it's kind of like it's a culture around publications, fashion magazines or other kinds of creative publications, where if you're into it, you're really into it and you're going to invest money into it. But if you're not, and maybe you're interested in like, you know, fashion shows and parties and maybe like websites more so than physical print, it just wasn't really something that I was super drawn to at the time. And I always wondered who buys magazines? Like I was just asking myself that all the time. And then I was like, okay, well, I've never seen like a disability magazine. The ones that I have seen are very depressing, and not at all kind of like reflective of the kind of person that I am and who I'm sure other people are too. I just don't know them yet, you know. So I really wanted to identify a community for myself. So I guess the early days was more about me publishing writing around my experience of illness and disability, and having people respond to it and seeing what those responses were. Often it was people from the industry whom I'd worked with in the past, and I didn't know they were suffering with an illness, but you know, they were hiding it, similar to maybe I had been in the early days. Or you know, I was finding other people who had just recently been diagnosed with cancer, or people who had disabilities, I just didn't know about them. So slowly but surely I began to cultivate a community through social media, and I just decided that I was going to make something. I called it a zine because at the time I didn't know how big it was going to be. And by the time I'd finished, it was much more of a magazine in size. But I think so much like a zine in not just concept, but kind of like the roots of it, which were very kind of community centered, very, very DIY, because I didn't have any funding, I didn't have any support. It was just like me roping in my friends, and people that were kind of willing to help me put something like this together. And frankly, a lot of it was me, just kind of making something, you know, writing things, having interviews with people. But I was very, very scared to show people initially, because I just did not know what the reaction was going to be. There was a big fear of, am I getting it wrong? You know, you spend a lot of time working on something, and just to kind of be met by criticism is very disheartening. So I was nervous about that, but also just that maybe it was weird of me to like do interviews with people and ask them about their health. I guess I'd never really seen content like that in a fashion magazine, or a creative publication, or even in the creative industry. Nobody was asking people about their health, you know. So it felt like something, that hadn't been done before, even though, you know, I was just living in a bubble at the time and I didn't realize kind of how big the disability community was. But I think the disability community has really grown massively with technology and the kind of development of social media and things like that. So previously, where you would have been completely isolated and potentially the only disabled person in your village or in your town, you know, suddenly you have all of these disabled friends that, you know, are from around the world. And it's really amazing feeling, to be honest, to find something like that. Because if I'd never created Abel, I mean, I don't know where I would have been today. You know, it's actually a really scary prospect to think about, because it's so lonely. Like, illness is one of the loneliest experiences, I think. And to have that at like the start of your 20s, I mean, everyone's like, it's the time of your life. Like, these are the best days you're ever gonna have. And I'm like, these are the worst days like I've ever had and could ever have imagined. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of create a positive out of what was a really negative time for me. And yeah, it's been onwards and upwards since then. The support has been amazing.
It's amazing. I feel like by you sharing your experiences and finding other people with similar experiences has given other disabled people almost permission to just exist as they are, without shame, which I remember when you set it up, and that sort of relief I felt going through the Instagram originally, when, you know, you just started it, and I was like, wow, I needed to see this. It's so important, to give
I really
that.
wanted to I talk about it regularly, but this idea of like breaking taboos. I think talking about your health period is quite a taboo topic, and talking about the negative impacts of disability is also quite taboo, because I guess inspiration porn is very prevalent in how other people perceive disability. So you're either faced with people being like, I don't know how you do it, you know, I'd rather die. And people say very, very insulting things like that all the time, that, you know, they couldn't imagine anything worse, and they, you know, just rather not deal with it at all. So I think that's also why there are a lot of films around people wanting to die because they've become disabled. It's a very negative thing. I don't know why people make films like that, to be honest, but I guess it's its own genre in a way. And then on the flip side, you have this kind of like putting disabled people on a pedestal, and they don't necessarily have their own lives and their own opinions. It's just, look at this person, or look at this child, this disabled child who's, you know, maybe experiencing barriers that other kids don't have to, and wow, how inspirational is it that they're existing, you know. And I think both of those are really toxic. So for me, like, breaking down taboos is just creating pockets of representation and visibility and communication around, you know, illness, disability, creativity, love, sadness, joy, fashion, music, whatever it is. Obviously, there's a lot of barriers that people are going to face existing as disabled people in society, in a society that's inherently ableist. And it really infiltrates all of our industries. You know, it's not just fashion and creativity, but, you know, look around you, essentially, and kind of, where do you see disability? And oftentimes it's just not there. It's not been allowed in, you know, or it's undercover because people are existing but kind of shielding that aspect of their life because they don't know how people are going to react. Often, if you think about kind of accommodations in an employment kind of way, people can express and communicate the disability that they have and what support they need, and people will listen, and it will go in one ear and out the other. And that's a really challenging experience to have as well, because it's like you go out of your way to talk about something that's difficult for you, and you ask for help, and people literally just, like, they'll acknowledge it and then it will be like completely forgotten. So I think that's also like a fear for people, that if they do talk about it, it will just get, you know, ignored. And I think there's so much, you know, that we need to do to improve disabled people's experiences. But like I say, it's across all industries. And that's why I was really interested to talk to you guys about adaptive fashion as well, because in the fashion industry, you know, I've got a friend who's been making adaptive fashion for a while now, but she's non-disabled, and we had a really interesting conversation about it, and this idea of whether she is doing the right thing, because should she be doing it at all, you know, like making clothes for disabled people when she's not disabled. But essentially, like, I just said, it's not like your fault, because disabled people have a really hard time existing in education and getting a higher education in a fashion school, because those buildings are not even accessible. So how can we, you know, promote people going into the adaptive fashion world if they can't get through the bloody door? You know, it's like, it's, you know, so I support her being in the industry, and I support what she's doing, because I think people need to do it. You know, we need to see universal design. We need to see more people finding solutions, I guess, and diversifying clothing as it exists. But it's definitely difficult, I think, to there's a lot of fear that non-disabled people have around disability, and I completely understand it, because, you know, when I was non-disabled, I was ignorant. You know, I had a disabled parent, but I didn't really think about disability existing around me other than, you know, inside my house or inside my family. But and I always think, you know, like, I don't really judge people for not responding to disability if they've never experienced it. I don't necessarily think it's great that we've kind of molded people into this way of kind of ignoring the challenging things in life and kind of turning a blind eye to when they see suffering or where they see inequality and things like this. But at the same time, I don't judge them for it, because I think often it's innocently done. And this is where a lot of the kind of tension comes from between disabled people and non-disabled people, and a lot of fear around language and whether people are using the right terminology and things like that.
Yeah.
And often, you know, it's not their fault. So I like to kind of remove a lot of the gatekeeping and the kind of harmfulness around people wanting to engage with disability but maybe not having an education in it and not having, you know, learn from disabled people. And that's what I think is great about Abel, that you can pick it up as a non-disabled person and just learn, and no one's gonna kind of like come out of the page and shout at you for like not having known that before, because why should you, you know? So I think it's such like a subtle way of educating people and a subtle way of, you know, broadening people's awareness. And that's why it's also really important to have a spectrum of disability kind of inclusion or representation. So another thing or reason why people are very kind of scared is because, well, maybe they've only learned about disability about wheelchair users. You know, maybe that's all society is teaching them, but they're not teaching them about learning disabilities or cognitive disabilities or chronic pain and all of these other forms of illness and disability that isn't kind of painted on the sign. That's how I see it.
Claudia, how do you see the changes that could be made within the industry or to educate? I completely agree with you and like resonate with you on you talking about the worry about getting it wrong, and you don't want to discourage people from entering this world because they're worried about getting it wrong. Like Open Style Labs is made by a group of people who are able-bodied and have disabilities, so you need to work together. It's not and exactly. I think it's opening the conversation of discussing and being curious and acknowledging that everyone's coming with different learning levels. But what changes do you think are the next step? Sorry.
Well, I love the term curious. I think it's a really great way to approach disability and anything that you don't know about, really. It's like, the thing that bothers me is when people think they know more than the other person, you know, whether it's the other person on the other side of the phone, the keyboard, whatever. There's always something to learn from other people. And if you go too strongly into something like, this is the belief, or this is what I was taught at school, and so this is what is right, you know, no, like collaboration and curiosity can go really, really well hand in hand if everybody, you know, removes the ego. I think, like, don't worry so much about getting it wrong, because if you do, you can just say sorry and move on, you know, with a sense of enlightenment from having learned something from somebody else saying, you know, actually that's not how I like to identify, or I'd rather you didn't say that because it comes from, you know, this kind of place, and it creates a lot of stereotypes or whatever it might be. There needs to be an open-mindedness, I think, about working with other people, and especially working with other communities. So I can't claim that I know even all things about disability. Like I'm always going to be learning, and I definitely don't know everything that there is to know about other marginalized communities as well. So sometimes I need to take a back seat, or I need to let someone else talk, you know, hand over the microphone or whatever it might be. And there needs to be, like, I guess, that open-mindedness, that curiosity, and a bit of humbleness in allowing yourself to get it wrong. And I can be pretty hard on myself, you know, when we do work around Abel, if I forgot something, you know, or if somebody forgot to add an image description or whatever it might be, you know, I'm like, it's not good enough. because you don't want to leave people out, and you don't want to be the one that forgot about that group of people or this type of thing. And it's definitely hard, but yeah, you know, don't beat yourself up. I think that's a really important message.
And I think giving the other person the benefit of the doubt as well.
Yes, intention is so important. So I really don't care if people use the wrong terminology, depending on the intention that they had behind it. I mean, if they were being aggressive and insulting intentionally, then of course, you know, I'll get my back will be up, and I'll like defend whoever, or, you know, get angry in response. But if somebody means well, or they're just trying to learn and maybe they messed up, then we need to respond in a way that doesn't create like a cycle of harm, you know, like, oh, maybe it offended you a little bit, so you're going to now treat them really negatively and they'll be too scared to come back. It's not progressive, and it's not a solution to behave like that. So yeah, definitely intention, I think, is really important. But I want to get to the proper question, which was how can we, you know, move forward as an industry or something. I think that the fear is probably the biggest thing that I think as an industry we have to overcome. But then there's a lot of structural issues as well. Obviously, COVID's been a massive issue the past year and a half, as we've been trying to kind of work on our next issue. And we had an editorial that we shot in March. It took a really long time to plan, but it might have been easier had there been enough accessible studios in London that had wheelchair toilets, but they just don't exist. I mean, some of them do. There's a very small amount that do. Maybe they're more expensive because they're more like filming studios where you may actually film quite large productions, and so they have to have those amenities, or whatever you want to call them. Smaller studios that are owned by independents maybe don't have the accessibility to make them suitable for working with disabled people. And one of the most problematic things we noticed was that a lot of them call themselves disabled access because it's, you know, floor level, but they don't have a toilet for a disabled person. So how can you call your studio accessible? And probably they're not getting called out for it because people, you know, you have to move on essentially. Like if you're looking for a studio and you've got something, you know, from 3 weeks time and you've got a lot to plan, I don't have time to sit and type emails out to that studio that's misrepresenting themselves and advertising in a way that's, you know, just a pain. It's ridiculous. It's very annoying. But I don't really have time to educate each and every person that I have to come across just to try and get a shoot done. So yeah, things like that is, I'm now thinking I have to go back and I have to email all of these people because it is actually so wrong. But yeah, we just didn't have the time. And I think that really shows like a lack of commitment from these people to actively work with disabled people. I mean, I don't know, they're probably breaking the law too, which is also, you know, very infuriating. But one of the things I want to talk about actually on this was like the importance of networking as creative people, and the way in which shortly before COVID, I was really struggling to network as a disabled person, because pretty much all of the events, maybe the building is accessible, but there's no chairs, there's no benches, there's no, you know, places to rest and sit, and basically, you know, standing for long periods of time and walking and things like that are really difficult for me. So if I can't network anymore, it really is going to limit like Abel as a publication and what we can do, but also me as an individual and where, you know, my career could go. So I think, you know, even with events, and it's so interesting actually how since COVID's come around, like there aren't any events anymore. Even online ones, there's barely any that the fashion industry themselves actually create. It's more, you know, organizations and advertising companies and all these different people who are maybe putting on online panel talks, or museums and kind of art galleries and things like that. But I've really not seen the fashion industry respond in a way that I think is very creative or, you know, enlightening. And it's almost as if the industry has been paused because you can't go out and party anymore and get drunk and socialize and all these different things. But, you know, even when they could, that the flyer, you know, the invitation, it would never have accessibility information on it. And that's because I'm the only disabled person they're inviting, you know. But the fact that they won't do it for me, let alone other people, is just proof, you know, that people don't think about accessibility. And so I don't think we can move forward without people having an education in what accessibility means. And unfortunately, it's extremely diverse, just like disability is. So what could be accessible for me is maybe not accessible for someone else. You know, I don't really want to be in a club that has like strobe lighting, for example, because I'll get a migraine and I'll leave 10 minutes later. But for someone else, you know, like bright light would be preferable. And for me, dimmer light would be preferable. So it's a very like small example, but it just goes to show you how when you learn about accessibility, there's still going to be a lot of questions, there's still going to be a lot of concerns, and, you know, kind of wondering how to get it right, like we said. But it's a balance, I think. And so people just need to be aware of that.
How do you advocate for yourself in these situations, and Abel as well? Like, how do you approach that? If that's a very open-ended question, but
I think you need to pick your battles. It's kind of, I definitely don't advocate for myself to everyone that I should. And there's a lot of like, there's a big emotional burden on advocacy, especially personal advocacy. And, you know, like sometimes I do modeling, for example. So often I'm having to advocate for myself in that context of, if I come to set, I need transportation, you know, there and back covered for me. I need to have a chair, you know, nearby. I need to have this, I need to have that. And often, you know, it's like I'm maybe the only disabled person that's going to be in that production or in that shoot. And I would actually love to advocate for other people and say, maybe you should have, you know, a wheelchair user, maybe you should invite this person, that person. But sometimes just advocating for yourself needs to be enough, because you don't have the energy and you don't have maybe even the confidence to bring up larger topics. And even around things like COVID, if I go somewhere and those regulations aren't being followed very strictly because it's just a fashion shoot and who really cares kind of thing, well, you know, now I need to advocate for all disabled people about why that's like a problem. That, you know, it's a massive health crisis, you know, that everybody's having to deal with. And so when people don't even care about that, and they don't take things like that seriously, how are you meant to kind of expect them to care about individual people's disabilities and how that impacts them? So gosh, yeah, I can't remember really what the question was, but I guess I'm more complaining about having to do the advocacy stuff because it is really challenging. But I think sometimes I feel also a bit empowered by it, because there's a confidence there that you kind of have to have if you're going to broach those topics with somebody that you know is maybe ignorant to the realities or the things that you're having to address. And so having confidence is kind of crucial, I think. And that's also a problem in and of itself, because what about people that can't advocate for themselves? Whether that's, you know, for an actual reason relating to their disability, or it's a confidence issue and more to do with anxiety and people's mental health. I think we need to have like, there's things that you can do like access riders, where you can have a template, and before you collaborate with a freelancer or somebody new that you're bringing into your organization, you don't have to send it just because they've maybe got on their CV that they have a chronic illness. maybe you should send it to everybody and see what everybody needs to feel supported in this role. So, you know, you can ask people explicitly, you know, is there anything we can do in terms of communication that would better support you in terms of the physical office space or whatever it might be. And then the onus isn't on the person to advocate for themselves. The onus is on you as a company to address that not everybody is the same, and you can't have the same expectations for absolutely everybody. Because I think we have a society that really bases itself around normality and what is normal. And the more that time has gone on, and COVID is a really good example of how pretty much everything in society has been cut off. You know, you can't see your family, you can't do cultural things anymore, you can't engage your creativity outside of your house, you know, or your local environment. But the thing that you can still do is work, and we should all be doing it, you know, 7 days a week, and never get time off to do anything else or take care of yourself, because it's pretty much the only thing society cares about in a capitalistic sense. And so yes, I think we culturally need to take a step back and look at how we approach things like work, because I don't think it's healthy for non-disabled people or disabled people, really, in the way in which it's been approached within COVID times anyway. And I guess it's maybe a bit of an assumption, because there are people, you know, who maybe work as like tattoo artists or in hospitality who've lost their jobs and haven't been able to work at all. And so that's a completely different, you know, community of people, as opposed to those that have been able to work remotely and are having to do kind of everything through their computers. So yeah, it's not a one size fits all, but I think it's a good example of the way in which we kind of assume that everybody can just do things and change and adapt, and, you know, not have kind of other things that they need to think about. Even something like childcare is quite a good example. Like, you know, maybe we make exceptions for people who we know are parents, but do we make exceptions for people that have disabilities? Probably the way in which those two different experiences are responded to could be very, very different, even though in reality it's just, you know, something that somebody else has to think about.
I'm also just thinking about how it's not a one size fits all, and my access needs, for example, I'm sure you feel the same, are completely changing all the time. I don't have one set list, and I think you brought up access riders, which obviously we try and be upfront about, like, do you need this thing, rather than offering it, rather than expecting the person to have to advocate for themselves, which from my experience is exhausting. But also maybe access check-ins, where you're checking in every so often to say, hey, do you still need this thing, or this thing, you can have it if you want it, and making sure that people know that option is available, whether they identify as disabled or not. Making sure that option is available if they need it at some point, and opening that transparency up. So,
there's people in the industry who they respond to like Abel, for example, because of what it looks like, and they're like, oh, this is something new, this is something cool, let me reach out and ask them if they'll come and do this thing for me, even though I'm not offering to pay them and I'm not, you know, offering to help them in any way. So I'll get these kinds of requests, and maybe I'll say, you know, I'm really sorry, but because I'm disabled and I work on Abel for free, you know, maybe I can't do this without you, you know, offering me a fee. Or maybe I can't come and record this podcast with you unless you pay for my transport. And then it's like, you know, whoosh, and they're gone. And it's like, you need to be willing to support us if you want to use us, you know, and fetishize us and do whatever, make something of the conversation that we're going to have or the work that we're going to do. It's like this reciprocating, essentially, because it takes a lot out of me or whoever that identifies as disabled or chronically ill. Like, these aren't just things, like mythical things that don't impact our lives. Like they impact our lives in a really serious and fundamental way. So, you know, get your hand in your pocket and stop being stingy. Like if you work, like there's so many people that work on a salary and I have to work with for free, and like that conversation is never really approached. Like who's looking out for my welfare?
Dance around it.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I think sometimes people don't realize how privileged they are. You know, maybe just being able to work a 9 to 5 and sit in an office and access employment in that way that most disabled people can't. And I think we really need to respect that actually, like, disability is kind of its own industry, it's its own kind of body.
It has value. Yeah.
And you can literally pay people to come and inform you about, you know, accessibility, disability, inclusion, whatever it might be. But I don't see enough people employing disabled people, and so I think that's actually the biggest thing that as an industry we could move forward in. And I think, you know, gosh, there's probably a lot of companies and people use this term of like the diversity kind of token, the person that's employed based on diversity's sake. And I mean, there's a language and there's a culture around it which is inherently problematic. But I think we've not even gotten that far with disability yet. We're not even having to deal with that problem because nobody is employing disabled people. Probably a big overstate, putting up all these kinds of like things that maybe don't have any basis. But
unemployed in the UK, I think. And I think if you're a disabled creative, that's made 10 times harder because first of all, creative work isn't particularly valued as a whole. And then throw in like a marginalized identity like disability, and it's like, oh, we don't value at all. So yeah, no, completely. It's so hard.
And young people as well. Like young people are systematically underpaid. And I think, yeah, like you say, the creative industry has a way of kind of devaluing its creatives. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of sort of funding. And I think it would also be great for there to be more funding in this industry because Abel, us as an organization, we've really struggled to get kind of external support, financial support, or find funding opportunities because funding for publications doesn't exist. You know, if I could find an angel investor, that would kind of be like the greatest thing ever because I've got 1,000,001 ideas and I would love to see them all through. But unfortunately, it's like one thing at a time, and often it's such a challenge just to get the little things done. And then when you add accessibility on top of it, you know, us as an internal team, like we're all working for free. And when these paid things do come up, like my first reaction is just to kind of spread the love and try and pay everybody else because I know how difficult it is. But at the end of the day, it's just not enough. I think we've had to have a lot of resilience as an organization to keep going because there's a lot of kind of rejection, I think, when you don't have, it's not even, you know, people externally rejecting you, but it's just that feeling of it's so tough, you know, it's so difficult, and maybe if I was doing something else it would get me more results, you know, or it would get, I'd be able to afford this or that. And yeah, it's really difficult. So I don't think that young creative people necessarily have enough opportunities. And this is what happens when you start something new, like you start something and you mean to grow it, but that, yeah, funding's really difficult because there's all these different kinds of eligibility criteria, and often it's for more like independent artists who are looking to put together an exhibition, or they want to do a dance thing or whatever. Working with a community and doing something as a collective and putting something like a publication together, you won't meet those criteria. Basically, you won't, because it's too broad and it is too much of a risk for people. You know, there's politics and all these different underpinnings of like having even a like written pieces. So yeah, it's really, really difficult. But now we've basically had to do a thing where we try to partner with brands and get funding from brands, as opposed to kind of like arts organizations or disability organizations or charities or anything like that. I mean, it's difficult because it puts us in a state where we have to kind of deal with the commercial, you know, and it maybe can take away a little bit of the authenticity from what you want to do. But at the same time, I'm still very inherently grateful for any funding that people want to offer us.
Claudia, I wanted to ask you as kind of like a closing question, because you're touching on it already a little bit, but what is the future of Abel Zine and where do you wish it to go?
Well, we're doing so many different things at the moment, and issue 2, you know, we've already been working on it now for 7 to 8 months. And time flies so quickly, you know, but it just goes to show you how much it takes, because there's so many different things to think about and deal with, and lots of different people to work with, and different ways of working that works for other people, and so much to think about basically. But you know, I would love to do print publications ongoing, but I also recognize that it's not accessible for everyone. So we want to do more digital content as well. So like for this issue, we've been recording our interviews and trying to edit them together and caption them, so people can both read the magazine and watch the content, you know, in a different capacity. And so hopefully we'll be doing like a virtual reality kind of launch for issue 2 as well as a print. And then also kind of externally to that, we are doing a little bit more consultancy now. And what I think Abel is like an umbrella, because I want to do sort of creative agency type stuff and work with lots of different companies. The consultancy also, maybe people have a tendency to kind of want to get to know accessibility in a way that is more accessible to them because of how we are as a company and who's in it. You know, we're a group of young people with disabilities, as opposed to going to kind of more institutions that maybe have a more of an outdated kind of identity about them. And so, yeah, I mean, I would love to have a shop. I would love to make mobility products. Like that would be such a huge thing for me, because I think there's a massive cost issue with products for disabled people. I mean, they really jack up those prices and it doesn't seem fair. But also the stuff isn't good enough.
It's
like it's
so clinical.
It's not had
you
enough.
You still see the Zimmer frame with the tennis balls at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's these motorized wheelchairs and things. That's, yes, they're great as they currently are, I guess, and do serve a purpose for some, but they're so heavy, you know, and they're really difficult to maneuver, you know, in the way that I would use it. And I think if I can't travel with like a scooter, for example, it just really limits my ability to go out and socialize and have a place in like the external world. And, you know, even household products and things like that, I just think stylistically, there's so much more that we could do. And I would love to see more investment there. And then, yeah, the world is our oyster, I think. I think we do have a really bright future. And I would just love to, I would love to have my own modeling agency as well, because I think like I have to cast disabled models all the time if we're going to do stuff for the magazine. So I also think that's a very kind of growing industry, and there should definitely be more disabled models being used. And it's so, I think it's really telling actually how, you know, there's mainly like one disabled model that's getting jobs at the moment, and it could be so much more. And I feel like once people see like one person, they'll jump on that person, you know, and everyone will want to go and use them because they're developing, you know, like a a feeling around them that's kind of, I guess, more of a celebrity status kind of thing, which isn't, you know, necessarily a bad thing, but actually we need to be generous with the opportunities that we provide. And I don't think I should be the one having to create them all. You know, I would like to see other people doing it in different parts of the industry. Don't be afraid, you know, to like go outside of like the most obvious choice, basically. And that also includes me, because I do see myself getting offered opportunities that could definitely be going to other people as well. And then, you know, the whole invisible disability thing versus visible, there's a lot to think about when it comes to disability representation. And yeah, just being that kind of curious and, you know, inherently nice spectator, I think is a really great person to be if you're non-disabled and you're in this industry and thinking about, you know, how to kind of connect with us. Just, you know, take a back seat and kind of learn, and then we can move forward.
Amazing. Thank you so like, wow. I love everything you say, by the way.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for today.
You're welcome.
It was really great chatting, and you brought up so many topics that I could see us talking for many more hours.
I try to get as much into my sentences as I can. So I know we've covered a lot of different things.
And if people, Claudia, if people want to find you, where do they find you?
Well, you can follow Abel Zine on Instagram. We do also have a Twitter, but we rarely use it. If you go on there, you can probably also find my direct Instagram, and you know, you can find it on Open Style Labs Instagram as well, because I'm in one of their recent posts. And or send me an email. My email is claudia@abelzine.com.
Amazing. We'll also, I think, put it in the comment if we can as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've got a website and everything, abelzine.com, and yeah, feel free to reach out because we love to hear from you.
You know when the next zine will be out at all, or just any date?
I
know.
I'm gonna say about 2 months' time. So if you don't see us by July, I've probably fallen ill and haven't been able to do any work. But fingers crossed. This is why I'm like, I don't know if I should be vaccinated before we launch, just because I want to mitigate falling heavily ill from being vaccinated. But yeah, we're very close to the finish line at this point. We're just doing layout and trying to kind of polish everything to the state that it needs to be. But we've been working really hard for the past 6 months to work with these different disabled people and commission lots of great writing and illustrations and everything. So there's a lot coming.
Thank you. We're really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much.
I can't wait to see what it comes out, and oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Thank you for your time and thank you for your energy. I appreciate it a lot. Love chatting to you. That's when I'm so bad at signing off, but
no, just thank you very much for being with us. It was wonderful talking with you, and yeah, I'm sure this will be one of many conversations we'll probably have in the future as well. So
yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to work with you again. Thank you so much.
Good luck with
bye,
everything.
guys.